Going. All right, we are live. Good morning, everybody. Lance Turchioni here with you on Ask the Agronomist this morning. We were almost late here this morning. I forgot a piece of equipment that we have to do this, and had to make a quick trip back home to go get something that I left at home the first time I left the house. So I think I got my shirt on. So I am a little bit frazzled here this morning, but good morning. And I got a busy day here at Monmouth. We got a big intern training going on here as soon as we're done with Ask the Agronomist. And so I will be spending 2/3 of my day in the friendly confines of Monmouth. Got Heather here with me this morning. So thanks to Heather for making the inefficient trip from Kickapoo to Monmouth and then to Roanoke after we're done here. So she's going the wrong direction to get to Roanoke this morning to help me out. So appreciate that greatly. We've got several topics that I would like to cover. That lots of stuff going on in the fields. Planting's pretty well done. Lots of spraying going on. There's always issues out there, even though we've had a pretty kind spring, to be honest with you, especially when you compare our spring to other parts of the state, other parts of the country. We got nothing to complain about. So if you have traveled east or south, primarily, you know how fortunate we are. If you heard about the haboob, I think, isn't that what they call the windstorm? A haboob. And if you've ever seen like I think like in some of those, I haven't watched the Mummy movies, but I think in those movies you see like big desert sandstorms and stuff. I think they call those a haboob. I think that's where the term comes from. It's kind of like the Middle Eastern desert regions of the country. And haboobs are not something that we typically have in Illinois, and the people that had it don't want to have any more either, because it was kind of a nasty, messy, unfortunate thing, kind of a black eye for agriculture, really, because you had soil blowing and you had residue blowing, and it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't, because if you do tillage and bury your residue so it doesn't blow away, then your soil blows away. And if you left your residue on the surface to protect your soil, then the residue blew into your neighbors' yards and filled road ditches and buried their fences. And so just a really unfortunate thing. Lots of sandblasting, lots of wind damage, there was a little bit of replanting actually that happened because plants just literally got sandblasted off from all that soil and dirt moving in the air. So just a quick reminder, I see my old friend there, Adam Henniger, saying good morning to me. That's nice to see, Adam. Thank you. And Adam's moved on to bigger and better things in his life, but he's still hanging around with Ask the Agronomist, so that's nice. And that reminds me, if you've got questions, please put them in the chat. Heather's here to make sure I don't miss your questions. And as always, I can fill the time, but I would much rather fill the time answering your questions rather than just guessing about what you're interested in. So, other stuff going on in other parts of the state. Obviously, Southern Illinois is still struggling to get the crop in the ground, and feel for those guys. Just been a brutally tough spring for Southern Illinois. They often have, about 3 years out of 5, they have a hard time getting the crop in because it's just too wet. And then as soon as they get the crop in, planted in muddy conditions because it was too wet, then they have a drought the rest of the summer. And you got to be tough to make a living farming in Southern Illinois. They do not get the weather patterns as good as we do. They don't have soil as good as we do. There's a reason if you're buying land, there's a reason you can buy it cheaper in Southern Illinois. So been a tough, really the southern part of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio have really up the Ohio River Valley there. It's just been exceptionally wet. There are places in Kentucky and Southern Illinois that have had 40 inches of rain plus already this year, which is 50% more than what they would normally have for the whole year. And we aren't even in the months that are typically the wettest yet. June and July are typically our two highest moisture months. And there's places have already had more than a year's, normal year's worth of rain. So, we have been pretty fortunate here, but we've still got stuff going on out in the fields. We've got some herbicide injury. We've got some herbicide carryover. We've got a little bit of few things going on that we'll talk about here this morning. Probably the first one I want to talk about is rootless corn. And I was in a field looking at rootless corn yesterday, and I neglected to take some good pictures that I could have showed you. Count yourself fortunate if you've never seen rootless corn, because it is one of the saddest things you will encounter. Because what happens with rootless corn, when your corn gets up to about V4, V5, and you've got this nice little corn plant growing there, and then the next day it's laying flat on the ground like this. And then when the wind blows, it flops over and it's laying flat on the ground over here. And then when the wind direction changes, it flops over again and it's laying flat on the ground over here. And so floppy corn is another term for rootless corn. And what's really going on there, and it gives me an opportunity to get up on one of my favorite soapboxes, and that is planting depth in corn. So we've got our soil line here. You've got your seed down here. Seed roots come out. Everything's going great. Mesocotyle's coming up. Spike comes out. Plant's growing up here. Everything's cool. Your crown, which is where your nodal roots start growing from, wants to form about halfway between the seed and the soil line. And it also wants to form about an inch above the seed and about an inch below the soil line. So Heather, I'm gonna put you on the spot. If you got to have an inch here and you got to have an inch there, how deep do you need to plant?
2 inches.
Atta girl. So that's where the magical 2-inch corn planting depth comes from. Now you can plant deeper than 2 inches, but a lot of you, either intentionally or accidentally, I'm not so sure. I don't think I've ever looked at a field where a farmer admitted that he planted less than 2 inches on purpose. They know what the right answer is, so you always tell me you planted 2 inches deep. How it got to be an inch and a quarter magically after you planted it, I don't know. I'm not saying you're lying to me, but we need to plant deeper oftentimes. And I get it, if it's cold, if it's wet, if you're planting early, if you've had, stand establishment issues in the past, and you got it in your head that, if I just planted a little shallower, I'd have had a perfect stand. And my rule of thumb of this is this: if you honestly feel in your heart it is too cold, too wet, or too early to plant at least 2 inches deep, that means you shouldn't plant. It doesn't mean you should shallow up because of the things you're worried about. It means you should, if you don't have the courage to put it in the ground at least 2 inches deep, leave it in the bag. Because what happens is, as you start to shallow up your planting depth, let's say you plant an inch deep, which is pretty extreme. I don't often find corn planted an inch deep, although I do find that every year. So what happens here is, you got your seed roots. Seed roots are fine. Seed root system doesn't really care where you plant it. Your mesocotyl comes up. Your plant's growing. Really looks about the same. It might be a little smaller because sometimes when you plant shallow, the seed doesn't germinate quite as fast. Or when it's wet, if you plant shallow, it actually comes up faster. And that's why some people like to plant shallow, because they've heard from somebody that you want your corn to be uniform and you want it all to come up fast and you want it all to come up even. So it kind of makes sense that if you plant it shallower, it's going to come up faster. And you might have heard me say, because I've said this, the faster it comes up, usually the more even it will be when it emerges. So I get the temptation to plant shallower when you can. But what happens is, the 1 inch that the plant likes to have between the seed and the crown is kind of necessary. So you can't set your crown right where the seed is. So this 1 inch here doesn't change much. But the 1 inch up here changes a lot. And so what happens to this poor guy over here is, he's trying to set his crown about right there. And there's 3 things that nodal roots cannot grow into. They can't grow into, something hard as this wall. They can't grow into air, and they can't grow into dry soil. And when your crown is trying to form right here next to the soil surface, if your seed furrow cracks open a little bit, it's going to be trying to grow into air, which is sometimes what causes rootless corn, especially in no-till situations. But this year, and the years that we see rootless corn are dry springs. We don't have dry springs very often, but we certainly had one this year. And we had a lot of crowns that were too close to the surface in dry soil, and the nodal roots are not able to grow into that dry soil. So what happens is this plant gets bigger. Eventually, it is being supported by nothing more than this flimsy little mesocotyl here, because there are no other roots other than the roots at the seed, and they don't give any support. So when the plant gets big enough that it gets top heavy enough, it just falls over. And we were very fortunate to catch the widespread good soaking rain that we had 10 days ago. We got emergency?
Yes.
Is there tornadoes in the area or something?
No.
So anyway, we were fortunate to get that rain because, even if your corn crop was headed for disaster with no root system, if you get that soil wet, those roots are going to be able to recover. They're going to be able to grow. Now, I'm not saying that plant hasn't lost some potential. I'm not saying that plant's going to be what it had the potential to be had it established a good root system. And I think in some cases that plant won't even be able to grow the root system that it would have otherwise had. So it's going to get through the rest of the season, maybe with a root system that is less awesome than it could have been had it gotten off to a better start. Now, in a year where we get frequent moisture and the soil surface doesn't get super dry, even if you plant shallow and even if your crown is setting close to the soil surface, and even if things are a little bit jacked up here because you don't really have room for them to grow the way intended to, you don't really notice it because you've got moisture. But this year we were just so dry. I'd had a couple rootless corn calls, and then we got that rain, and I think the other 200 rootless corn calls that were coming, aren't ever going to come, because I think those plants will, if you go out and dig, you can find lots of plants that the nodal roots, are not very well developed. And this is why, but they are developing now. They will develop, and I think we kind of averted disaster. If we'd have missed that rain 10 days ago, I think there would have been widespread rootless corn. And what can happen is if that, we call it floppy corn, if that corn plant's flopping around enough and it doesn't get a rain, eventually it's going to break off. And I have made, and it's a sick thing to have to do, I have made replant recommendations in early June for fields of corn that came up in April and were beautiful until, the rootless corn showed up. And that's a really sad thing. One of the saddest things I see in my line of work is a perfect stand of corn that came up well, that you were proud of for weeks, and then all of a sudden you discover it doesn't have any roots, and you're tearing it up and starting all over again. So the planting depth thing is really important. And this was a dry spring, and in a dry spring, you should be very comfortable planting 2 inches plus deep. I get it in a wet spring that might scare you a little bit, but I would say for every one situation I find where maybe planting shallower would have been better, I have 10 that planting deeper would have been better. I just have far more issues because guys plant too shallow than too deep. And another thing I want to spend a little bit of time on that I think is a contributing factor to this. So I'm going to give you all the benefit of the doubt that soil settling after planting is a real thing, and the seed looking deeper the day you planted it than it looks today when we dig up the plant. Because if you didn't realize this, let me tell you something. I can tell you how deep the seed was planted when you harvest. We can tell all year long, because all year long you can find where the seed is, and you can tell where the soil